Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Monday, Yom Sheni. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehud in South Carolina, Yosef in New Jersey, Guy in Ohio, Bill in mid-Missouri, Bella in Florida, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Jonathan in Southern California, Lorraine in Texas, Shandor in the Bronx, Gail in snowy Kansas City, Chaim in Florida, Aoife in Florida, Ella in Southern California, Eleni in Silver Spring, Marjorie in Georgia, Alan in New York City. Welcome, everybody. Today's class is sponsored by Paul Feldman in honor of Giselle Feldman. Paul, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and we thank you for enabling us. We say amen, and thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. Okay, the fun keeps a-coming here in Tractate Sanhedrin. Really interesting stuff tonight, and some great history and colorful stories. Let's just get into it. This is going to be great. Okay. We're in Mishna number 2 here in chapter 2. This first Mishna ostensibly is just about whether a king is allowed to participate in mourning for a person that died. Is this an infringement on the honor and dignity of the crown, as it were? And it's going to take us to an interesting spot. Okay, Mishnah number 2. We're picking this up, I don't know, halfway down, a quarter of the way down on page 20a here in Tractate Sanhedrin, the 24th volume of the Talmud. Mishnah number 2. I have a little bit of a sore throat, excuse me. Okay. If a relative of the king dies, he does not emerge from the entrance of his palace, as it does not befit one of his stature to accompany the deceased. Rabbi Yehuda says, if he wishes to follow the bier, B-I-E-R, he follows it, as that is what we found with regard to King David, who followed the bier of Avner. Avner was not a relative of King David, and yet he joined the funeral procession. As it is stated, 2 Samuel 3, chapter 3, verse 31, and King David followed the bier. And the sages said to Rabbi Yehuda, what are you talking about? You can't learn out a law about whether a king joins a funeral procession or not from that incident in the Bible, because the matter was only to appease the people, so that they should not suspect David of ordering Avner's death. And when the people comfort the king, so that they should not suspect David of ordering Avner's death. And we're going to get into another law about kings and funerals. But this episode, absolutely fascinating. 2 Samuel, chapter 3. I'm not going to read all of it. But it's highly recommended. I read it preparing for the class, and it's just so interesting. You know, you think of, the first king of Israel, Saul, or in Hebrew Shaul, we know he was not able to hang on to the throne, and he was supplanted by David. And the prophet Samuel, said to Saul, you've blown it. You are losing the throne because you did not obey direct orders from God. And so normally that's what we remember, and that's what we think about. There was just something lacking in Saul. He was, prominent and noble enough to be appointed the first king, to be anointed the first king of Israel, but he wasn't able to hang on to the throne. Beautiful story of the friendship between his son, Jonathan, who would have been the next king, the heir apparent, and the friendship he had with David. And Jonathan recognized that David was really what Israel needed more than his father. But Saul also recognized that David was popular, incredible warrior, and tried so hard to defeat and even to kill David on numerous occasions. Eventually, Saul died. Okay, Saul died. He fell in battle, and so did Jonathan. And then David assumed the throne. And if you don't read it, and if you haven't read it carefully, that you just assume, well, from the time that David, he had so much hardship before he became king. Later, he had hardship as a king because there was a lot of wars with the Philistines, and there was also huge problems with his own sons, like Absalom, who rose up and rebelled against his father, and it would have been a civil war. But what's an interesting episode in between all that is that, Saul had his followers. Saul had another son, Ishbosheth, who wanted to be king, and there were people who supported him in that. And David's throne was by no means locked down and secure in those early days of his kingship. Now, the episode that's being referred to here is that in the house of Saul, right, there was a very famous warrior, I guess a general, Avner, who was loyal to Saul. And so when Saul was fighting against David, Avner was on Saul's side, and Avner was an enemy of David. David recognized in Avner that, what he was not so much David's enemy as a loyal and effective warrior for Saul. And David saw an opportunity to work with Avner, who could come over to his side, as it were, because Avner recognized that what Israel needed, what the nation needed, was King David. And so he was willing to work with David. And so there's an incident where Avner goes to visit David, and he goes in peace, speaks with David. They make the agreement that they're going to, he's going to support David in his kingship. And then David, of course, allows him to leave in peace, and he's going to help David secure his throne. Problem was Yoav. Yoav was sort of like David's chief warrior in general. And Yoav's brother had been killed by Avner when Saul and David were fighting against each other. And Yoav couldn't believe that his enemy, Avner, had come to see his master, King David, come in peace and left in peace. What are you talking about? This guy's our enemy. David said, no, he's not our enemy. But Yoav said, David, you misunderstand the situation. This guy is our enemy. And Yoav took matters into his own hands and killed Avner. And so it's in that context that when Avner's funeral was held, David put his own dignity and honor as a king aside and followed that bier with the other men who were mourning for Avner, because he wanted the nation to know that, and he says specifically that everyone should know that the house of David has no guilt, no blood guilt in this affair. It was not by my order or my hand that Avner has been taken from this world. And David even cursed Yoav in this incident. So, can we learn out from that a king can or can't join a funeral procession? No, because those were exceptional circumstances. That's 1 Samuel chapter 3, really fascinating story. Okay, another law now. And when people comfort the king with the meal of comfort after the burial of his loved one, all the people recline on the ground, and he reclines on the dargash, right? So the custom back then, now if you go to visit a shiva, a house of mourning, right, where people have lost a loved one, so the immediate relatives, right, a spouse, a son, a daughter, etc., brother, sister, will sit in very low chairs close to the ground, but not on the ground. In ancient times, the mourners sat on the ground. But for a king to sit on the ground, not possible, right? Because this is too much of an infringement on the dignity of the king who represents the entire nation. So he would recline on a dargash. Okay, that's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. The sages taught in a baraisa, in a place where women were accustomed to follow the bier, they would follow it, and the men would walk in front of the bier. And if the women were accustomed to walk in front of the bier, they would go in front of it. Rabbi Yehuda says women always go in front of the bier, as that is what we found in regard to King David, who followed the bier of Avner, as it is stated, and King David followed the bier. And presumably, David did not go among the women. And the sages said to him, the matter was only to appease the people. And they were appeased, as David would go out from among the men and go in among the women, and went out from among the women and went in among the men, as it is stated. So all the people and all Israel understood that day that it was not from the king, meaning David, to slay Avner, son of Ner. That's 2 Samuel 3:37. Rava interpreted a verse homiletically. What is the meaning of that which is written in this incident? And all the people came to comfort David. It is written to destroy, lehakrot, and we read to comfort, lehavrot. Meaning, in the beginning, the people wanted to destroy him as they suspected of ordering Avner's assassination, who, after all, the problem was there was this whole civil war going on between Saul and David, but it was in the context of much bigger wars, more important wars, more dangerous wars for the Jewish people from the Philistines, right? So even as they were fighting with each other, the real enemy was the Philistines. And David knew that. David never wanted to fight with Saul. David would have been happy to serve Saul. And that's why we say that Saul lost the throne because he disobeyed God. David would not have taken the throne from him. But when Saul coughed it up, so to speak, by disobeying God, then David became the next in line and was given the throne. But David knew that the more important mission was to fight the Philistines. And Avner was also a great hero in that battle. Now, Rava interpreted a verse homiletically. What is the meaning of that which is written? Quote, and all the people came to comfort David. It is written, did I just read that? I just read that, sorry. So Rav Yehuda says that Rav says, for what reason was Avner punished by being killed? Well, it is because he should have protested to Saul, when he was Saul's advisor, about the killing of the priests, the Kohanim of Nov. You can find that at 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 17 through 19. But Avner did not protest. Rabbi Yitzchak says he did protest. So that is not the reason for his death. But he was not answered, right? It was not an effective protest. And both of these sages interpreted one verse, which says, and the king lamented for Avner and said, should Avner die as a churl dies? Your hands were not bound, nor your feet put into fetters. As a man falls before the children of iniquity, so did you fall. That's 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 33 and 34. What is David saying? Is he saying you fell because you deserved it? Or is he saying, why did you fall? You were a mighty man who should not have had a death like this. What's he actually saying? So the Gemara explains how each sage understands the verse. The one who says that Avner did not protest in this incident when King Saul killed these priests explains that this is what the verse is saying. As your hands were not bound, nor your feet put into fetters, right? You were not chained. So what is the reason that you did not protest against Saul when he went and killed these Kohanim? Because he thought they were a threat, that they assisted David and they were therefore a threat to his kingship. Therefore, since you could have protested, but you didn't, then the result was, as a man falls before the children of iniquity, so did you fall. And the other view, the one who says that he did protest, but he was not answered, explains that this is what the verse is saying. David wondered, should Avner die as a churl dies? Your hands were not bound, nor your feet put into fetters. Since you protested at the right time, you weren't chained. So why did this happen to you? Since that is the case, what is the reason that as a man falls before children of iniquity, so did you fall? Right? Was David saying you fell because you deserved it? Or was he saying, why did you fall? You didn't deserve it. So the Gemara asks, according to the one who says that Avner did protest and therefore didn't deserve such a death, what is the reason that he was punished? Rav Nachman, the son of Rabbi Yitzchak, says it is because he delayed the kingdom of the house of David 2.5 years by supporting the kingdom of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, for this period of time. After Saul was gone, Avner remained loyal to the house of Saul, right? So his old friend Saul, now it's his son. He thought that his son should have become king, not this other guy from some other family named David. Now, the Mishnah teaches, and now back to kings and mourning practices. So, and when they comfort the king with the meal of comfort, he reclines on the dargash, said the Mishnah. So the Gemara asks, what is a dargash? Ula says a bed of fortune, which would be designated in houses for decoration and for good fortune, and no one would sit on it. And the sages said to Ula, is there anything which until now we did not authorize one to sit on? But now in his time of mourning, we seat him on it. If you have this thing called the bed of fortune that somehow is going to, be a decorative bed that is going to bring more, riches into a household, why would you sit on it in a time of mourning? That's the opposite of what we're thinking about. We want to bring the mourner low. So that's not what it means. Rava objects to this question. What is the difficulty in this? Perhaps sitting on the dargash is just as it is with eating and drinking. As until now, we did not feed him nor give him drink. But now in the time of mourning, we feed him and we give him drink. People bring the meal of comfort to the house of the mourner. So rather, if it is difficult, this is what is difficult. As it is taught in a baraisa concerning a dargash, the mourner is not required to overturn it during mourning. Rather, he stands it up on its side. And if it enters your mind to say that this is the bed of fortune, why is he not required to overturn it? But isn't it taught in a baraisa with regard to one who overturns his bed during mourning? Not only does he overturn his own bed, but rather he overturns all the beds he has in his house. Now, it's interesting that these laws, which our sages are discussing in this passage, about overturning the bed, had already gone largely out of practice among the Jewish people at the time of the Gemara. They're still studying it because it used to be the law, but already people weren't doing it so much. So in the earlier days, where you have this idea that the mourners are going to sit on the floor during the week of mourning, then they're also going to sleep on the floor. How are they going to sleep on the floor? People lived in houses with dirt floors. You're not going to really make them sleep on the dirt. So what they had, just imagine a kind of a cot, like a single bed. It was a typical type of bed where there are 4 posts, in the corners of the bed, and then rods connecting the 4 posts, and then webbing, connecting those rods, the bed frame, so to speak, with leather straps are going to hold up the mattress. And because the bed, let's say that these posts at the corners of the bed are like 3 feet high, right? So the bed frame is probably 2 feet off the floor. And that means that there's 1 foot of post sticking above the bed frame. So if you turn this whole thing over, now the bed, instead of being 2 feet off the floor, is going to be 1 foot off the floor. It's lower to the floor, and that's what it means to overturn the beds. But not every bed is susceptible to being turned over like that. Like if you have a 4-poster bed where the posts hold up a canopy over the bed, obviously you can't turn over the bed. Maybe you could turn over the mattress, but you can't turn over that kind of bed. But what they're talking about is when this was being done and they had the kinds of beds that were turned over, what about this dargash? Because the dargash Is it a bench? Is it this bed of fortune? Whatever it is, it's like a bed, but it's not a bed, right? So are we going to subject it to the same rules that we would beds during the period in Jewish history when they overturned the beds when they were in mourning? Okay, that's a basic background here. Let's get back to where we were. Okay, so the Gemara responds. What is the difficulty in this? Perhaps the lack of requirement to overturn the dargash is just as it is with a bed that is designated for the storage of garments and not for sleeping. It's really a bench that people just pile stuff on top of. As it is taught in a baraisa, if it was designated for the storage of garments and not for people to lie down on, he is not required to overturn it during the week of mourning. Rather, if it is difficult, this is what is difficult. As it is taught in a baraisa that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, one is not required to overturn a dargash. Rather, the mourner loosens the straps and it falls on its own. And if it enters your mind to say that this is a bed of fortune, does such a bed have straps? The bed of fortune is more like a bench. So rather, when Ravin came, he said, one of the sages said to me, and Rav Tachlifa was his name, that, that he was often in the market of the leather workers. And he said to him, what is the meaning of dargash? That even the sages are not quite sure what a dargash is. And so that man said to him, it's a leather bed. And Rabbi Yirmiyah says that Rabbi Yochanan says the difference between a regular bed and a dargash is this. A dargash has its weaving on its inside in that the straps woven to hold the bedding are tied in holes inside the bedposts, while a regular bed, has its weaving on the outside in that its straps are tied around the posts. So here, maybe you can see in this figure, the upper one is the dargash, where the straps, the leather straps that hold up the mattress, are tied to holes in the rods that hold up, that are the bed frame. And in the lower one, that's a regular bed where the leather straps wrap around those rods and hold up the mattress that way. And you can see that the dargash is basically a little bit more elegant because the straps that hold up the mattress would not be visible on the outside of the bed frame. And that's why a king would have a more high-end or higher-end bed, right? So now we're on page 20b. And the Gemara raises an objection from the Mishna, Tractate Kelim. From when are wooden vessels considered complete and therefore susceptible to tuma, right? A vessel or a utensil, something found around the house, whether it's furniture or a pot in the kitchen, if it has the possibility of becoming ritually impure when it comes into contact with tuma, with impurity, and then it itself becomes ritually impure, tameh, it only has that possibility when it is a finished utensil, right? So somebody who makes pots and pans, the pots and pans in his shop that are not finished yet, because he's still working on them, they are not susceptible to tuma. But once you can say, okay, that utensil is finished, then it becomes susceptible to tuma. So what about furniture? So we're going to say at some point, like maybe, some guy could keep working on it and he would say it's not finished. And another guy would say, what are you talking about? I don't need all those decorations on my bed. I'll sleep on that bed the way it is right now. Thank you very much. So then it is finished. Okay. Well, so as a general matter, for the usual typical bed, from when do we say that it's finished and therefore susceptible to tuma? In the case of a bed or a crib, this happens once they are rubbed with fish skin, which smooths the wood. A nice little peek into the ancient world. They used fish skin, some people would say from stingrays, as sandpaper to smooth the wood. Now the Gemara asks, and if a bed is woven on its backside, as Rabbi Yochanan claimed, why do I need rubbing with fish skin? Doesn't the weaving cover the smooth part of the bed? Rather, instead of Rabbi Yochanan's explanation, say that the weaving of both this and that, a dargash and a bed, is on its inside. And the difference between them is that on a bed, the straps go in and out of holes on the post, whereas on the dargash, they go in and out of loops. Rabbi Yaakov says that Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel that a mourner is not required to overturn a dargash, but only to untie the straps around its posts to let it fall on its own. In connection with this matter, Rabbi Yaakov bar Ami says, in the case of a bed whose posts, naklitim, on which the canopy is spread, in the case of a bed whose posts extend, meaning that they are very long, like a four-poster bed where the posts are really long and hold up a canopy, so that the bed would remain very high off the ground if it were overturned, the mourner doesn't overturn the bed. Rather, he stands it up in the time of mourning, and that is sufficient. I'm not sure what that means, stand it up, whether maybe he means that he doesn't sleep in that bed, he puts it off to the side, puts a mattress on the floor and sleeps on that. I'm a little unclear. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Now we move on to Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 2, Tractate Sanhedrin. And the king brings out people for conscription in an optional war, i.e. a war that is not mandated by the Torah and is not a war of self-defense, on the basis of a court of 71 judges, the Great Sanhedrin, and which we learned, right, in chapter 1. And he breaches fences of anyone in his way to create a pathway for himself for his various needs, and no one can protest his power. The pathway of the king has no measure, neither lengthwise nor widthwise, and one cannot protest that this pathway is wider than necessary. And all the people take spoils in war and give them to the king, and he takes the first portion of the spoils. It's not that he keeps all the spoils of war for himself, but he gets his choice, his pick of the spoils. That's Mishnah number 3. Says the Gemara, we already learned this on another occasion, meaning the Mishnah on page 2a of this tractate, that an optional war, the king has to, consult the Sanhedrin, and they have to vote in his favor before he can prosecute an optional war, since that obviously affects the welfare of the people. And the king, and that's what it said in the Mishnah the first Mishnah of our tractate. It said, and the king may bring out the nation to an optional war only on the basis of a court of 71 judges. So, why did our Mishnah here need to repeat that Mishnah from there? And the Gemara explains, since in the Mishnah here, the Tana of the Mishnah taught all matters pertaining to the king, he also taught the law of bringing out the nation to an optional war. Although this law was already taught at the beginning of the tractate in the context of the laws of courts and how many judges they need, here it's being taught in the context of what are the rights and responsibilities of a king. Now, with regard to the king's rights, the sages had a dispute. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, concerning all the actions that are stated in the biblical passage about the king, see 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 11 through 17. It is permitted for a king to perform those things. And Rav says that biblical passage was stated only in order to threaten the Jewish people so that they would accept the king's sovereignty with awe and reverence. As it is stated in the Torah, Deuteronomy 17:15, you shall set a king over you, meaning it is necessary that fear of the king should be upon you. But the king is not actually permitted to perform the actions stated there. So let's take a look at this passage, 1 Samuel chapter 7, right? Yeah, where was I? Yeah. No, it's 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 11 through 17. Okay. So what happened was that at the time that Saul, before Saul became king, there was no king, right? For the first 400 years that the children of Israel dwelled in the promised land, they did not have a king. They had judges, they had prophets, they had sages, but there was no king. And they did okay. So at a certain point, they got a king. Why? Why? Did God said the time has arrived for you to have a king? Definitely not. So even though the Torah, given at Mount Sinai, provided for certain laws that would obligate and bind a king, and it said that when you will have a king, predicting that eventually the people would have a king, because God knows everything and saw the future, but God wasn't saying you should have a king. Rather, the people demanded a king. The people said to the prophet Samuel, give us a king. Why did they want a king? Because every other nation in the world had a king, and they wanted to be like the other nations. Terrible motivation. Since the people of Israel are our king, is our Father in heaven, the Holy One above, we don't need a king. But the people wanted to be like the other nations, and they kept demanding, and God said, fine, give them a king, see how they like it. But when the matter was still being weighed in the balance, right? Remember, the first king they got was Saul, right? It was a failure and disaster as a king. And later, beyond David and Solomon, there were many disasters as kings. So the people realized how wrong they were. But when the matter was still being weighed, and the people were saying, give us a king, give us a king, give us a king, Shmuel relayed all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. And he said, these will be the royal rights of the king who will reign over you. He said, he, the king, will seize your sons and assign them as his charioteers and riders to run before his chariot, and assign them as his officers of thousands and his officers of 50, and to till his soil and reap his harvest and to manufacture his weapons and his chariots. And he, the king, will seize your daughters as perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will seize your best fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his servants. He will tithe your seeds and vineyards and give them to his officials and his staff. He will seize your best servants and maidservants and young workers and your donkeys, and he will use them for his own work. He will tithe your flocks, and you yourselves shall become his slaves. And on that day, you will cry out because of your own king, whom you yourselves chose. But the Lord will not answer you on that day. Pretty good warning why they don't need and shouldn't want a king. And what was the result? But the people refused to heed the voice of Shmuel. No, they declared, we must have a king over us, so we too will be like all the other nations. Our king shall govern us and go out before us and fight our battles. And so Shmuel heeded all the words of the people and repeated them before the Lord. And the Lord replied to Shmuel, heed their voice and appoint a king over them. Because we have free choice, right? We have free choice. God commands us, but we're free to disobey those commands. And when we do, as natural as fall follows summer, we reap the whirlwind and the consequences of our actions. And that's what happened, right? Saul was a disastrous king. David was very good. So at least, God gave him a great king. And then Solomon, a great king. And then it fell apart completely. And they realized how much better they would have been off without a king. But then it was too late. Okay, so the question is, all those things where God says, well, this is what's going to end up happening. The question is, are those things permitted? Are these verses written in 1 Samuel to teach that these are the rights of a king? And that according to what it says there, that's what a king is permitted to do by God? Or are these verses coming to say you're going to have lawless kings and they're going to do all this stuff and abuse you and exploit you and take from you? Why would you want that? Right? Was it a warning or was it a promise and thereby enabling the king by law to have all those rights? That's what these two sages are arguing about. Okay. So the Gemara comments that this dispute is parallel to a dispute between Tanaim, as it is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Yosei says concerning all the actions that are stated in the biblical passage about the king, it is permitted for a king to perform them. Rabbi Yehuda says this biblical passage was stated only in order to threaten the Jewish people. As it is stated, you shall set a king over you, meaning it is necessary that his fear should be upon you. The Baraisa continues, and so would Rabbi Yehuda say. 3 mitzvahs, 3 commandments were commanded to the Jewish people upon their entrance into the land of Israel, which apply only in the land of Israel. And they were commanded to establish a king for themselves. So it was a commandment to establish a king, or the law provided for it, but it was recommended they not. And to cut off the seed of Amalek, but if they did establish a king over themselves, then he would be bound by the laws that are written in the Torah. These other laws, we're not sure. They're in the book of Samuel. Are they laws or are they just warnings? But actual laws would be the laws in the Torah about a king, and that they should cut off the seed of Amalek in war, and that they would build the chosen house, i.e. the Holy Temple, in Jerusalem. Now the Baraisa continues. Rabbi Nehorai says, this biblical passage about appointing a king was stated only in response to the Jewish people's complaint. As it is stated, when you come into the land that the Lord your God gives you, and you shall possess it, and you shall dwell therein, and shall say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. Doesn't sound like God was particularly favorable to this, even in Deuteronomy 17:14. The verse indicates that appointing a king is not a commandment, and that when Samuel spoke to them, he intended to frighten them so that they might regret their complaint and retract their request for a king. It is taught in a Baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer says, the elders of Samuel's generation asked appropriately. As it is stated, give us a king to judge us. 1 Samuel 8:6. So what they wanted was a steady leader in place of Samuel, because Samuel was getting older. But the ignoramuses among them ruined it, as it is stated, but the people refused to heed the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but there shall be a king over us, that we may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and emerge before us and fight our battles. Right? They were looking for a short-term solution that became a long-term problem. It is taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Yosei says, 3 commandments were commanded to the Jewish people upon their entrance into the land of Israel: to establish a king for themselves, and to cut off the seed of Amalek in war, and to build for themselves the chosen house in Jerusalem. But I do not know which one they are obligated to do first. These 3 mitzvahs that are incumbent upon the people as a people in the land of Israel, to establish a king, to defeat Amalek in war, and to build the temple, what order should they do those things in? So when the verse states, the hand upon the throne of the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation, in Exodus 17:16. So you must say that this means they are obligated to establish a king for themselves first, before waging war with Amalek. And the verse is interpreted like this: throne of the Lord is nothing other than a symbolic name for a king. As it is stated, then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord as king. 1 Chronicles 29:23, indicating that a king sits on the throne of the Lord. Now, the Baraisa continues, and still I do not know whether building them the chosen house is first or cutting off the seed of Amalek is first. I.e., after you appoint a king, which you do first, defeat Amalek or build a temple. So when the verse states, and he will give you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you will dwell in safety, and then it shall come to pass at the place the Lord your God shall choose to cause his name to dwell there, there you shall bring all that I command you, Deuteronomy 12, verses 10 and 11. So you must say that the Jewish people were to cut off the seed of Amalek first, and then build the holy temple. And so the verse states concerning David, and it came to pass when King David dwelled in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies, And it is written immediately afterward that the king said to Nussin the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within curtains." And King David then began seeking a site to build the temple. Now, the Gemara cites another tradition about Solomon's kingdom. Reish Lakish says, initially, Solomon ruled over even the supernal worlds. As it is stated, 1 Chronicles 29:23, then Solomon sat on the throne of the Lord, indicating that his kingdom was like the Lord's kingdom, reigning over all the worlds, the upper world and the lower world. But ultimately, after he married foreign wives, he ruled over only the lower worlds here on earth. As it is stated, for he had dominion over all the region on this side of the river, from Tifsa even to Gaza. 1 Kings 5:4. Now, Rav and Shmuel disagreed with regard to the meaning of this verse. One says that Tifsa is a name of a place at the end of the world, at one end of Solomon's kingdom, and Gaza, on the shore of the Mediterranean, sat at the other end of his kingdom. And the verse serves to teach that just as he ruled over Tifsa and Gaza, so he ruled over the whole world. Reish Lakish continues, but ultimately Solomon declined further still, in that he ruled only over Israel. As it is stated, I, Koheles, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. Right? That's Ecclesiastes 1:12. And ultimately, Solomon, ruled over only Jerusalem. As it is stated, the words of Koheles, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, in Ecclesiastes 1:1. And ultimately, he ruled over only his bed. As it states, behold, it is the bed of Solomon, 80 mighty men are about it, and the mighty men of Israel. That's Song of Songs 3:7. And ultimately, he declined so much that he ruled over only his staff. As it is stated, and this was my portion from all my labor, Ecclesiastes 2, verse 10. Rav and Shmuel disagreed with regard to the meaning of this latter verse as well. One says that the term "this" is a reference to his staff, and one says that it is a reference to his cloak. But in the end, he didn't rule over anything, right? Only either his staff or his cloak. I mean, he lost everything that the mightiest king in the world once had. And the Gemara asks, did he return to reign over the whole world, or did he ultimately not return? And Rav and Shmuel disagreed about this. One says that he returned, and one says that he did not return. The one who says that he did not return reasons that Solomon was first a king, and then he was an ordinary person, and he did not return to his reign. And the one who says that he returned reasons that Solomon was first a king, then he was an ordinary person, and ultimately returned to be king. And that's all we're going to talk about Solomon. I'm almost done, by the way. Questions or comments, please get them in now. But we covered in some depth in Tractate Gittin, page 68b, the incredible, truly incredible story of King Solomon and the demon king, right? The demon king that challenged Solomon and was ultimately able to throw Solomon, hundreds of miles away, where he landed and was just, an ordinary person wandering around trying to, walk home and get his way back to where he was, and the demon king had that power because Solomon's spiritual level had fallen. And this would be consistent with Ecclesiastes, where we see, a king who had everything, but also who walked around like an ordinary person. And so that story, wonderful, wonderful, colorful, dramatic story, highly recommended. Take a look at it if you don't remember it. Tractate Gittin, page 68b. Okay. The Mishna teaches that the king breaches fences of anyone in his way to create a pathway for himself. Like if he's marching his army toward the battlefield, he goes wherever he wants. And the sages taught in a Baraisa, treasures of kings taken as spoils in war belong to the king. And as for the rest of the spoils that are taken in a war, half is for the king and half is for the people. Abaye said to Rav Dimi, and some say that he said this to Rav Acha, granted treasures of kings belong to the king. This is the typical manner of kings, as it is fitting that the king should use the treasures of the kings he conquers. But with regard to the rest of the spoils that are taken in a war, where half is for the king and half is for the people, from where do we derive this law? And he answered, Abaye, the source is as it is written, and they made Solomon, son of David, king the second time, and anointed him unto the Lord to be leader and Tzadok to be priest. 1 Chronicles 29:22. And this verse compares a leader, referring to King Solomon, compares him to Tzadok, the high priest. And just as for Tzadok, half of the showbread given to the priest is for him, the high priest, and the other half is for the rest of the Kohanim serving in the temple, the other priests, so too, for the leader, half is for him and half is for his brothers, i.e. the rest of the army. And the Gemara asks, and with regard to Tzadok himself, from where do you derive that the high priest takes half of the showbreads? And the Gemara responds, this is as it is taught in the Baraisa, that Rebbe says, the Torah states with regard to the apportionment of the showbread, and it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place. Leviticus 24:9, from which it is inferred, half is for Aaron, the high priest, and the other half is for his sons. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 3 here in chapter 2. We'll pick it up tomorrow with Mishnah number 4. Take a few questions. Jonathan, bed of fortune. Does it seem idolatrous to anyone? Sit here and things will happen? Where is God in this? I would agree with you, and it's even worse. Don't sit here. No one can sit there. It's the bench no one sits on. And somehow that brings good fortune into the house. I don't know where they got that tradition. It does seem strange. Joe, the weaving of the rope or such looks a lot like what we had in colonial America. And the rhyme, nighty-night, sleep tight, refers to the weaving to hold the bed off the ground. If the ropes weren't tight, the person in the bed could fall to the ground during the night. Wow, wonderful background. Thanks, Joe. That's so colorful. I like it. And yes, it's that kind of primitive bed, which, you know, technology now, right? We have a new technology seemingly every other year. But for most of the history of humanity, like, they had, you know, a pretty consistent way of doing things. And the way they made beds, you know, probably wouldn't change for centuries. Now things change so fast. Bill, here's the problem I have with the idea that the elders of Samuel's generation were in the right to ask for a king for steady leadership. As such, a king is a hereditary leader, but thus far in the, let's call it the tribal republic of Israel, the problems that arise from leaders are often a result of subsequent generations being worse than their predecessors. Eli and his sons are a good example, of course, but an even better one is Samuel. Because when the people come to Samuel to demand a king, what do they say? Your sons do not follow in your ways. Give us a king. As if a king's sons are going to be even a bit better. Just so. But the people were foolish and didn't listen to reason. And last comment from Moshe Cabrera. I brought your book of jokes and it's excellent. Thank you so much, Moshe. And if I may impose on you, my dear friends, anyone who has bought the book and enjoyed it, please give a rating, 5 stars ideally, and a nice review, you know, how funny and enjoyable and well-written the book is on Amazon. That would be a tremendous goodwill service for me and for accidental Talmudists, because, you know, the more people read the book, the more it gets out there, the more that they can connect with the Jewish tradition. And those of you who've seen the book, you know, I even though it's just a book of jokes, I have footnotes in there. I do refer to certain Torah practices, traditions, and laws. You know, and it's a way to get some Torah out there into the culture. And people who are intrigued might just come to us and learn Torah with us. So, you know, help people connect with our tradition and with accidental Talmudists by rating and reviewing the book on Amazon. Really appreciate it. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Tuesday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great